Why did the Roman Empire fall? It didn't fall because it was attacked from the outside. It fell because people lost interest in it, and therefore others came in with completely different ideas. Others that you could not even visualize today because they were poor from the East, had not many material possessions. So what is the world dependent on? What are high buildings dependent on? They're not dependent on how big they are, on their physical structure. They're dependent on human interest. And what is human interest? Human interest is that the world, each place, each city, each building, each neighborhood, does tell a story. Now, even the most banal building tells you a story. It's a very short one. It says, I have nothing to tell you. It's a kind of a Beckett story. But I think great buildings, great neighborhoods, are about the human spirit. And if we now think about New York for a second, with Ground Zero, of which I'm a master planner, the world changed really at that moment. You know, often people ask me, where was I on that day? We know where we were, because since that time we travel differently, we look at the news differently, we look at the television differently, we look at our neighbors differently. You know, I was not in New York, I was in Berlin. After 12 years of working on the Jewish Museum in Berlin, 9/11 was the day it was to open to the public. And I went to the studio that day, turned to my colleagues and friends and said, this is fantastic. This is the first day I don't have to think about history, because people will come into the museum, the Jewish Museum in Berlin, and make their own experience of history. Unfortunately, the building never opened, because at 2:38 p.m. Berlin time, we saw those images, attacks on New York, on Washington, Pennsylvania. Museum did not open for 3 days. And that's when I thought that history is always intertwined in very complex ways. It's never in the past. It's always coming up from the future. So when I presented my ideas for Ground Zero, which I'm grateful I won, I didn't start with tall buildings. That was the last thing on my mind. I started with the fact that in the 16-acre site, the most important thing was people, the public realm. Create as much public space in the dense area of New York as possible. So out of the 16 acres, half of it is public space, 8 acres. And I suggested not to build. You know, all my colleagues, great friends and architects, proposed mega towers, mega buildings. I said, no, build absolutely nothing where people perished. Put the buildings in the periphery, just at the edges of the site. Create a site that goes to the bedrock, that has a memory, that says something to people. Now, I show you this not because I'm an egoist or a vain, but to show you that the project has so much interest. I mean, so many clients. We've got the families of the victims, in the thousands of people who lost their families, brothers, sisters, uncles. We've got the Port Authority, one of the largest organizations in the world, with 7,000 engineers and architects, governed by two powerful governors of New York and New Jersey. Streets of New York, the mayor of New York is in charge of. Path train authorities underneath, MTA, subways. So you can see that for such a project, you need to gather a consensus. And I'm a true believer in democracy. You know, it's not good to have a tabula rasa, build yourself a tall building and go on your yacht. You know, you have to fight for what you believe in. And drawing on the left is a sketch. Drawing on the right perspective is pretty much the realization today. Very, very close. And by the way, I was not interested in just aesthetics of single buildings. Sure, there's a 1776 so-called Freedom Tower. The towers descend in a symbolic sense, echoing the Torch of Liberty. You know, I thought of my parents. You know, I grew up in the Bronx. I'm from Poland originally. My parents were factory workers in New York, in the sweatshops of New York. And I thought, what are these people gonna get? Those people are never gonna be in those glossy towers at Ground Zero. They're gonna be in the subways, on the streets. They should be able to see New York in an inspired way. That's who I'm building for. I'm not just building for those who are lucky enough to be in those towers. So there is the master plan. You can see the footprints, the slurry wall in purple, the circle of buildings, bringing back the streets of New York, no longer the podium, creating a vista towards the Hudson River rather than towards Wall Street, and creating really a master plan that people could get behind. You know, public participatory process. And very political, by the way, extremely political and very emotional. What is most important about this plan is not what you see on the streets, it's what's underground. Because underground there are 75 feet of infrastructure, of trains, of foundations that have to be built. You have to figure out everything, and every square centimeter costs a lot of money. So everything is intertwined, everything has to work together. The slurry wall. Now I tell you a really interesting story, which you can now see as you go to the visitor center at Ground Zero. Maybe some of you have been. This slurry wall, which we should have never seen, I was standing with all the finalists, final 7 architects in One Liberty Plaza, and some engineer on a dim November day said, does anybody want to go down to the site? And all the architects, really, the most famous in the world, said, no, it's much easier, much better to see you see it in plan perfectly. But something moved me and my wife and partner Nia to go down. And I have to tell you, in this windy, drenched, gray November rain, my life changed as I walked down that ramp, 75 feet. And I suddenly felt something. That's the spirit. And I touched this wall, and the engineer said, that's the slurry wall. Now, I studied architecture, but I had no idea exactly what it meant. It's a dam. On the other one side is the power, on the left side, the power of the Hudson River. This is a wall that withstood, otherwise all of our subways would have been flooded. Well, so I fought to preserve the fragments of this wall, and it's not easy to have a living foundation exposed. It's built in order to put something on top of it. But I thought it was so important, the visceral, the reality of being at bedrock level. And by the way, when I was with the Pope just recently, he selected to sit in front of the slurry wall. He could have sat anywhere. It's a big site, but there is something powerful about foundations and about living foundations, foundations that move across memory into the future. Of course, the public space of the memorial is key. When I first proposed that it not be built upon, it was controversial. And by the way, I also proposed waterfalls. People thought I was bringing Niagara Falls to New York in the tabloids. But in the very beautiful Michael Rudd Memorial, you can see the need to screen the sound of busy streets and the need to have nature in the center of New York with the names. It's a very moving place. 25 million people have visited the this place. It's still a building, construction site. Something like 5 million have visited the museum underground, which is open less than a year. So it's the power of communicating. And I think architecture, urban planning, tall buildings are communicators. I created an extra public space. There's not enough public space in New York. I call it the wedge of light between 8:46 a.m. and 10:28 when the second tower collapsed. I took this photograph. It's from the top, but you can see that it's an entrance that embraces also St. Paul's Church. Very important in the composition because they were saving people in this church, and also church with George Washington, went to pray for the good of democracy in this country. So these symbolic elements are all important, as is the Torch of Liberty. And even though the buildings stand in this grid, they turn in certain ways to echo that torch. And that torch, and you can see here, Freedom Tower, the tower number 1, tower number 2, you can see it here with the angle, together with the PET terminal, creating that wedge. You can see the actual footprints. You can see tower number 3, which is already much taller. Tower number 4 is already built. By the way, that was part of the idea. Don't design a mega structure because no one is ever going to build it. Break the 10 million square feet of density to as many towers as you can for 3 reasons. Number 1, it's a more practical way to plan because nobody will just build everything at once. Number 2, lower towers are actually better for the environment, because they don't create the wind tunnels and the terrible things that very high towers create. And number 3, they are also safer. So here it is. This is, you see already tower number 1, tower number 4, but very soon you'll see this silhouette. And it's important that this silhouette is not only in the skyline, but it's on the ground level and can be experienced. And I end here this short presentation at Ground Zero because, as I said, I was an immigrant from a totalitarian country, from a communist country. When I came, I was one of the last to arrive by ship because it was cheaper to fly to Kennedy right after, late in 1959. And actually, I was woken up by my mother. My sister and I were woken up in the boat, 4 o'clock in the morning, you're going to see New York. And I tell you, there's nothing to prepare you for New York. I don't care what cities you've been to, but New York is just, there's There's a magic, there is the impossible. There are all the dreams, desires, human interest is there. And of course, that Statue of Liberty, which I saw up so close from a ship, that's how it was meant to be seen, by the way, has that beautiful poem by Emma Lazarus. Give me your poor, give me your immigrants, give me those who have been rejected from other places. Come here. This is the place where you can breathe free. That's what architecture is about. It's about breathing free. It's about the free world. It's about democracy. Now, I had another chance in a city I love, in Milan, that's far away in Italy, where I also live, to work with 2 other architects, but I was also the one who designed the master plan. It's in the center of Milan. Milan is a historical city. It's a Roman city. It's got architecture on layers of every kind. This site in the center of the city became available. It used to be the Fiera di Milano. They moved to the suburbs. And there was a competition. I think every architect in the world entered. And we won you entered with company, with Generali, the insurance company. And you can see that it's basically green. I used to live in Milan many years ago. My daughter was born there, and I said that it's always asphalt. Milan needs green space. Create a green piazza. Create buildings, housing around the low scale, and then in the center, put the towers, a new competitive idea of Milan. I'm working with Zaha Hadid, who did the skyscraper on the left, Arata Isozaki, Japanese architect, on the right. My own is in the middle, but master plan and the housing block on the left is ours. So there's the center. It's a new image for Milan. But I always say, it's no longer nations that are in competition with each other. It's cities, as was just pointed out, that are in competition with each other. It's Milan, it's Frankfurt, Berlin, it's Tokyo, New York, Beijing, Shanghai, Singapore. Everybody's in competition. So what do? You have to assert some sort of a connection to the tradition. And there are already tall buildings. The Pirelli Tower, Torre Valesca by Ernesto Rogers. So I thought it was appropriate to create something fantastic here. And my idea was this curvilinear building. It's an office tower, which is under construction, to create this fantastic piazza. It's got the Metropolitana station, the subway, shopping. It's a major hub, 10 minutes from the Duomo, very close to walk, but a completely different sense of a city. It's no longer just the hardscape, but parks and, housing, places for people to live, entertainment, shopping. So there it is. It's all under construction. It's not so easy to build in Italy. It takes a little time, but it's getting there. It's almost there. The residential buildings, they have to be very commercial. They have to be repetitive floor plates and so on, state-of-the-art technology. But you can shape them, if you take a great effort, to shape them with large terraces so that they do have individuality. And they create some sort of social space where people enjoy being together. It's not just towers in the park like in the 50s. And to create vistas that really take advantage of the beauty of a completely new kind of floor plate, new light in Milan. You don't have the same light any longer in the old 19th century buildings or even 20th century buildings. You got a completely new possibility of a social space, and that's what I keep emphasizing. I agree, diversity, which means different desires have to be met even within very stringent economic parameters. And you can see that I broke these large-scale buildings into segments, so they read differently. So they're not just these large blocks, but, well, look, there are thousands of people living there, so you have to provide the right environment. But it is something that has changed Milan, and there are at least now 2 or 3 other mega projects which are changing Milan. So tradition is not a contradiction to the future. It has to do with developing a city in ways that are powerful and redolent with the love for history. Look, Art Nouveau villas on the left, but they don't conflict. The scale is being picked up. There are penthouses, there are many other amenities, but the beauty of history is that you have to maintain the human soul of a city. And each city has a soul. You can't exchange them one for another. Tokyo is completely different from New York. I love them both, but each one, you have to kind of delve deeply into the whispering voice of the city and discover what can you do even with a high-rise tower or with such a prosaic thing as producing housing. But housing is the most important because it's easy to design tower, but housing is difficult. So here's housing. Another one. This is in a different part of the world. I call it Horizons because it's in Korea, one of the countries that I truly admire. You know, country that, I don't know, 50 years ago was a poor country, and now is one of the most sophisticated, technologically advanced countries. This is in Busan, right at the edge of that, you know, from the penthouse, you can easily see Japan. You know, it's not far. It's right, you know, and you know, it's a very dense, very tight site. You know, you can see how much density. This is, I don't know, 5 million square feet in this tiny site. What do you do? Now, Korea is interesting, but all the buildings are kind of still from the 50s sensibility, just extruded boxes. You know, I'm allergic to extruded boxes. But I know that they have to be there because you have to make sure that 80% of the building, at least, is extruded, but you can play with 20%, make something like a crown in a building, a social space on top, something interesting, and create something that will be really profitable, but also beautiful for the people. So there's a Park Hyatt hotel, residential towers, office building. Now you see, this looks a little crazy because the plans are complex. It's not just a box or a rectangle. It's a complex form that takes advantage. It's repeated in the site, but it gives very particular effects of atmosphere to very dense buildings. And I think that's important, to create an atmosphere where you don't feel like penned in darkness, but you love being up in that world. Well, the diagram is self-explanatory. We've got the mixed programs. We've got very important things on the ground level. We've got the technical floors. We've got hotels. We've got mixed use and so on. And you see it dramatically from the bridge. And I think what differentiates it, it is, by the way, I think the tallest residential project in Asia. But what differentiates it is that it isn't just some boxes going up. And by the way, there was a competitive project on the other side, which was started before, but people bought this ahead. They bought it right away because it's pleasant to see something that isn't just boring, something which is just the same thing you've already seen everywhere else in the world. Well, it takes an effort to shape a tower and make it still, you know, profitable for the investor and not some crazy thing. So here it is. You can see the competitive towers on the right. They all look kind of the same. They all are stamped out without any character, any desire to do anything. While these towers, you know, as heavy as they are, and they have thousands of people, they have a kind of a reference to Korea, to me. Korea is a delicate country with delicate culture. You know, they invented, you know, things like musical notation and keeping track of the government, and not only beautiful paintings. So that's part of Korea. And the towers are bold. They have state-of-the-art technology. They've got, you know, interesting ground level, the office buildings, parks, places for kids. You know, you get a little bit of sense that it's a kind of a gateway to another way of thinking. It's not just a gateway to Busan, just another way of thinking about creating a neighborhood. And that's what I tried to do in New York. Not, you know, the greatest proof of New York, and that was my goal, is affirmation of life in face of attacks on democracy, on New York, on America. And what is a better proof of life than 100,000 people have moved to Lower Manhattan? Now we have to leave our office buildings because they're being turned into, you know, residential. Fantastic. People have moved in. Families have moved in. All the grade B office buildings are being transformed to residential. There is a new impetus. All the retailers, hotels. For the next 30 years, Ground Zero is the hub of New York, just as it was when New York first started. So it's about more than just a standalone building. It's more than just contributing something to a program. It's really doing something for the city and for the people of that city. And look, an old Catholic theologian, St. Augustine, I like his writings because he's smart, wrote, you know, cities are not made from buildings. They are made from citizens. No, it's a civic process. And often the glorification of a single tower doesn't really do much for human desire. You could even make money with it, but so what? So here are the buildings, sort of aspiring to something other in Korea. And I think now Korea, I'm beginning to see buildings that are no longer just this kind of boxes. They're beginning to do kind of, you know, things that can be done with tall buildings. And tall buildings, look, we have no choice. We have no choice. This is what my favorite writer Isaac Bashevis Singer, do you know him? He got the Nobel Prize, he wrote in Yiddish. He said, we have free will, we have no choice. So we have free will, we have no choice for tall buildings. And there it is, it's the Hyatt is still being constructed here, but you can see the drama of these buildings anchoring the city and something sculptural, and I believe that's true. We often forget that architecture is not just technology and density and infrastructure and typology, it's a civic art. It has always been a civic art. People forget the art part. They think it's some goofy thing for some star architects, but no. Without the civic art, cities die. People lose interest in them. And that's why I said the Romans lost interest in going to the big baths. They lost interest in the Colosseum. They lost interest in the, hokey-pokey things that Romans were known for. And they turned to a poverty religion coming from deep east. So, what will the world be like in 100 years? What will it be in 50 years? We see the threats to public space, to cities, terrorism, wars, fundamentalism, ethnic division, income inequality, global warming. I can go on and on and on to see the threats. We have to have a really powerful spiritual vision of the future of the city, which is democracy, diversity, openness, and also fantastic architecture. Thank you.